Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is such a great turnout. I'm Julia Bloch. I'm the director of the Creative Writing Program, and today is Brooke Borel visiting us for the Applebaum Editors and Publishers series. And I want to thank the sponsors of that series, and also Jessica Lowenthal for helping me realize my dream of making an editorial style book the center of a Kelly Writers House program. I led a former life as a copy editor before I became what I am now, and I have a deep and abiding love for style guides, as everyone in my class knows, my class, The Art of Editing. So I'm really excited to have a chat with Brooke today about the art of fact-checking. I'm going to introduce our main guest, and then I'm also going to introduce the two students from Art of Editing who are joining me here at the table for our conversation. So Brooke Borel is the author of The Chicago Guide to Fact-Checking. We have copies of it for sale in the back. I really recommend it I feel like even if you yourself might never copy edit or fact-check, it actually is an incredibly useful tool for becoming a more informed reader of information. So I recommend it. And there's also a really great introduction to the value and significance of fact-checking. I feel like it's silly to say this is more relevant now than ever, because one of the things that Brooke points out in the introduction to that book is that has been said many times before. This is not the first generation in which people are crowing for a need for more accuracy in reporting. But, it's Michael Cohen Day, so I want to just reiterate, there are a lot of things going on that might make us think about how to be informed readers of various pieces of information. So in The Chicago Guide to Fact-Checking, Brooke Borel writes, if journalism is a cornerstone of democracy, then fact-checking is its building inspector. It's a book that not only provides concrete steps on how to mark up a manuscript, something I love. So there's actually like an infographic of what it looks like to mark up a manuscript as a fact checker, and determine what exactly needs to be checked, but also advice on how to deal with the more gray areas of fact checking, anonymous or sensitive sources, points at which an author might overstate an assertion, how to deal with litigious or plagiarized material, and navigating ambiguously reliable online sources to confirm information. The fact-checking guide is, as one reviewer noted, a timely and important addition to the Chicago Guides to Writing, Editing, and Publishing series, which continues to issue helpful treatises on a variety of topics relevant to writers, editors, and publishers. So again, I want to reiterate, I think this is a book that'll be of interest to everyone in the room who cares about language. So we read this book in its entirety for the Art of Editing class, in the unit that each year proves to be incredibly time-consuming and cause a lot of consternation for my students, who quickly realize just how much labor goes into the act of fact-checking. We also read a really terrific article that Brooke published last year called Fact-Checking Will Not Save Us from Fake News. She published that on 538.com, so I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about fake news and fact-checking today. Borel is also a science journalist by trade and has written on everything from particle physics to the seedy world of cannabis pesticides to the history of fake news for outlets that include Popular Science, The Guardian, The Atlantic, BuzzFeed News, 538, Scientific American, and Undark magazine. Those are not outlets of fake news. Those are outlets for which Brooke has written pieces on fake news. She's a contributing editor at Popular Science and an editor-at-large at Undark, and she teaches writing workshops at New York University and the Brooklyn Brainery. And her new podcast is called Methods, a show about how we know what we know. And actually, you just gave me a really lovely summary of that podcast. Could you give me maybe two more sentences on what that podcast is most invested in doing?
We're trying to get sort of at the backstory of how professional fact finders know what they know. So I am the host. I'm the only host. I talk to journalists and scientists and historians and other people who try and figure out the world around them about their process.
Great. So yeah, it seems like one of the coolest things about that podcast is that it crosses disciplines, it crosses areas of knowledge and expertise. So again, highly recommended. So with me on the panel, I have two students from Art of Editing. Caroline Curran is a Penn sophomore from Alexandria, Virginia, who's pursuing an English major concentrating in creative writing. Did you just declare that major like 2 minutes ago? And minoring in Hispanic studies. And Joost Vanderborg is a first-year student at Penn from the Netherlands who is interested in both physics and creative writing. We're actually workshopping a children's book about physics today in our Art of Editing workshop. So they've come up with a ton of questions. I have a ton of questions. We won't have time to get through everything, but we'll get through some of it. We'll start with a little discussion on our panel before opening it up to the audience, and I hope that all of you will feel free to join in. And also feel free to stand up and go get more food as we're talking. You know, there's lots of food in the dining room. Help yourself and don't be shy about coming in and out of the Arts Cafe. So Caroline wanted to kick us off with a question about this distinction between fact and truth. Caroline, what is your question for Brooke?
So, is this on? Is this working? So
does it sound good?
the question I had was about the distinction between fact and truth. So, Brooke, on page 9 of your book, you say, well...
do you want a copy of your book to look at the
Maybe.
passage
I
that we
can also pass it to you.
Here, you can use mine.
God, what did I write about facts and truth?
Sorry, I didn't warn you that we would be...
No, it's fine.
We would
What
actually be
page is that?
We go to
taking
the
you to a
text on
particular
page
passage.
Okay.
So you write, fact and truth may seem synonymous, but the words are distinct. And then you write, facts are indisputable. But the truth a writer builds from them is a matter of interpretation. So this is something that really struck me because I guess I had always considered truth as being like the parent in journalism. Like it was like the disciplinarian, like there is this truth and it can't be argued. And I guess I was kind of idealistic about that there was one truth. And now reading your book makes me maybe more of a realist. Do you think that sounds like a fair assessment?
I think that sounds fair. And I think that there's no such thing as an objective human, right? So even though we're dealing with facts, I think everyone in the room probably has had that experience of reading a piece of nonfiction or a piece of journalism, and all the individual facts are correct, but the whole thing doesn't ring quite true because there's something missing or just because of the way it's framed. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. We all have our own sort of way of looking at the facts. That doesn't mean that facts don't exist and that fake news is something we shouldn't be worried about or anything like that. But that's sort of what I was trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. Do you consider yourself a realist or an idealist about truth?
Probably more of a realist after spending so much time being a fact checker and being a journalist. It's hard. It's really hard work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that sense of needing to be a realist comes out of the concepts that we attach to truth and accuracy and fact, or if it's more about the relationships between different readers and writers and editors, a readership and a news platform, a writer and their publisher. It seems like so much about fact-checking is negotiation, as is all editorial work. It's a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, and every individual writer and editor have their own sort of biases and perspective, and every publication has its own perspective. So even by the act of writing a piece, you're leaving a lot out because you have to. So even that act of doing that is a version of this is what we think you need to know for the truth, right?
Joost,
Yes.
you have a question
I do.
that you wanted to ask, which is very particular
Yes.
to your own place.
So the current U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, his name is Piet Hoekstra, and he made headlines in December when he told people that in the Netherlands there was cars being burned, politicians were being burned, and that there were no-go zones. And this is comments he made way back. But then a reporter asked him about these, and once confronted, he told the reporter that his comments were fake news.
He told the reporter's
reporter.
comments
Yeah.
were fake news.
Yeah. And so, and this guy's like, anyway, so I don't want to discuss more about this, but I'm really curious about why has fake news become such an easy way to defend yourself in today's political
I
climate?
wish I knew. I mean, it's a phrase that it's an easy sort of phrase to throw out there, and everyone kind of knows what you mean, but then you can sort of twist it very easily. I don't know. I mean, people are even using it as jokes, like in everyday talk, right? Like, oh, I don't know. That's fake news. Like, go do something else. I don't know why it's so easy to do that. I think that. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit because I'm still thinking as I'm talking, which is always a problem. I think that anytime you have people in power that are trying to control the narrative, they'll grasp onto whatever the zeitgeist sort of is, whatever the conversation pieces sort of are. So we sort of define fake news as a specific thing, and then you have people in power sort of trying to take that and twist it to their own use. And I think that I can't think of historical examples off the top of my head right now, but I'm sure that after I get off this panel, I'll think of a lot of them. Like, there are probably many examples of that happening throughout history.
Well, you're reading Kevin Young's book Bunk
I am,
right now,
yeah.
and he's tracing this pretty long history of the hoax and how the history of the hoax, especially in the United States, is intertwined, especially with a racial history. And I'm wondering if maybe I feel like they're well, he does talk about fake news quite a bit in that book, actually.
I'm only 3 chapters in, so I haven't gotten to that part yet. But yeah.
But I guess someone needs to maybe write the history. Maybe someone is doing it right now. The longer history of not just the term fake news, but how it's come to circulate in the particular way that it's come to circulate.
I mean, it comes to be sort of propaganda, right? The way that you twist it and the way that some politicians are twisting it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's not just the content, but the method. The fact that, sorry to harp on this, the fact that Michael Cohen's offices were raided is a fact, but I'm sure someone's figured out a way to call it fake news in the way that it's been framed, in a way that narrative is put together.
I think if you go
The
on
media
Twitter right now,
outlets.
you'll see a lot of
Fake
those
news.
claims because I saw them on the way over here.
Yeah, and so the English professor in me wants to say that's not what that term means. You're conflating content and form. So I have a question about fact checking won't save us from fake news. In that article you write, you quote Angela Lee, who's a journalism and emerging media professor at UT Dallas, who notes that ideological fake news, that's the phrase you just used, lands in the social media feeds of audiences who are already primed to believe whatever story confirms their worldview. And I read that and I thought, yeah, I think she's connecting the present moment with a longer history of how we understand ideological echo chambers, which are not those chambers in the world of social media are not new. Those have sort of always existed, and there are ways in which people have always arranged themselves in spaces that will confirm what they already believe. We've always figured out ways to do that. So not this year, but the last time I taught this class, we looked at a few different examples of ways that organizations have made attempts to empower people to be more informed about false narratives or biased narratives. So we looked at On the Media's Breaking News Consumer's Handbook, and we looked at 10 questions for fake news detection, which came out from the News Literacy Project. So those are both like 5 or 10 like quick steps, like how to spot fake news, and it's everything from identifying headlines that are likely to be conflated or misleading to trying to be a more discerning consumer of a platform of a piece of media. And then something that seems quite quaint at the moment, which is the tool that Facebook rolled out last year, called How to Spot Fake News. Click here, and it led you through a number of steps. And I feel like in our class we were pretty good at coming quickly to the conclusion that those tools are certainly not the things that are going to save us. And I wonder if you have thoughts on what it means that this is like what we keep getting offered is these quick bullet point listicles, basically,
Right.
on what to do.
I mean, it's a really complex problem, right? Because it has to do not just with media literacy, which I think is what that's trying to get at, but and even though that's important, I think having a bunch of bullet point lists doesn't actually do enough. Like, you need to have media literacy starting in early ages in school, right? You need to have civics class early in school. You need to have the whole business model around the production of news and its sort of overlap with content, and even the fact that people call articles content, which I personally don't like very much.
Will you tell us why?
Because I feel like the news is really, this is the idealist in me, this is not the realist in me, but I feel like the news is supposed to be informing people. And when we talk about content, that's like consuming, and that's entertainment in a way. Mm-hmm. So creating content, I don't particularly like thinking of making the news content, but that's how we have to sometimes think about it when we're in a digital space.
Especially when we're thinking about aggregator sites, the way things go viral.
God, talk about fact checking. I mean, this happens a lot. This is a job that I think is very common when you're in early career right now, and that is getting a job aggregating a bunch of news for a news site. But then if there's a mistake on that first article and then it gets aggregated 20 other places, it's very hard to go back and correct all of those aggregations. Sorry, that's a side rant. But I think that it's a problem with the business. It's a problem with the whole business model and the implosion of the business model of media. It's a problem with politics. It's such a huge, there's so many tentacles of the problem that make fake news possible that having a listicle, like a how-to spot fake news isn't going to, and I even talk about the social media platforms too and their role in all of this. So it's just very complicated, and trying to attack it with just a listicle is not enough at all.
And it seems to me that one of the things that happens is it reduces the problem to the individual consumer of the news, of the content, of the information.
Which is part of it. I mean, we do, because social media is set up the way it is, it's so easy to click and share things. And I talk about in that piece the idea of the reader as a publisher, because every time you click or share or like something, you're basically publishing it for another audience that might not have seen it before, and you're giving it your sort of stamp of approval. So we have a role in it, but it's not all on us. We're part of a much larger, complicated ecosystem.
Yeah, and that ecosystem is changing.
Yes.
Caroline, you had a question about, again, page 9, learning how to fact check can help writers become better reporters. Do you remember that question? That you had?
Yeah. So you talk about how fact checking is sort of reporting in reverse. And then in a later chapter, you go through all the different steps that a fact checker will go through, like re-interviewing sources and going back and asking like questions that aren't just yes or no questions and making people spell things and all these different things. And it kind of just made me think, like, why don't fact checkers just write the article, you know?
Well, so first of all, this style of fact checking is the intense style that you would see in a magazine. And there are different sort of versions of this in newspapers. They don't have fact checkers. They don't have time to do that laborious process of rechecking everything. But part of the reason they do it in magazines and now increasingly in long form podcasts, like they have fact checkers at places like Radiolab and Invisibilia and big long form podcasts like that. I mean, the idea is to have just a third party. So you have the writer or the journalist who's going out and gathering information and building a story from that. And you have the editor hopefully pushing back and helping shape that and asking really good questions. But once those two have sort of been working back and forth and creating this thing, they have a lot invested in it. So the idea of having a third party do the fact checking is that they have hopefully a slight more objective view towards the work, and they don't, if something's wrong, they can push back more, or they can be more skeptical of it. It's very hard to be skeptical of your own work because you go through and if you try, like this is something that reporters do have to do, fact check their own work, but it's really hard because you'll sit there underlining all of the stuff that you've put in the story and you're like, oh, well, yeah, I know that's right because I picked the source and that was the best source possible, but it might not be. So it's really hard to have that. I mean, there's no such thing as human objectivity, I think, but it's hard to have the most perfect version of that for your own work. So that's why it's good to have a third party do it if you have the time and resources, which most places don't.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Jay Kirk.
Since you're on magazines, I thought I'd ask.
Yeah.
I write for magazines.
Oh, Jay, would you mind speaking into that microphone that's behind
sorry,
you?
Yeah, thanks. This is fantastic. But you're on magazines, so I write for magazines now and then. So I had a question that like pertained more to creative nonfiction, which is more or less the genre that I write in. And while I do, as you're saying, I mean, I spend an enormous amount of time fact checking my own work, and I believe in it strongly. But there's a lot of other things that you're also trying to accomplish in a story, and I feel part of it often, like a first-person point of view story, you're trying to get at truth from many different facets, and one of them is through your perspective of your experience of reality. So, I guess my first part of my question is like if you had any thoughts on the relationship between fact-checking and subjectivity. I mean, I have an anecdote in mind. I could
Yeah, sure.
I might
Yeah.
contextualize it, but so once, this is for Harper's Magazine, and I was told that since I had the opportunity to correct something that was wrong, which was essentially just something I had perceived and the way that I had perceived it, that since I had the opportunity to correct that first impression, that I should, because part of our job, and I think this goes across from most magazines that I've worked at, but part of our job is to kind of stand in as the final authority or the kind of know-it-all authority figure, where that's not really, in my opinion, and this may be a little meta, but it's not necessarily the whole job. I mean, part of our job is to go out and kind of experience and believe, even if you're allowed, even if that includes making mistakes and seeing things wrong. So I guess I guess my question is like, is it necessary to correct? Is it okay to be wrong? That's my question.
As a journalist, I like reading creative nonfiction, but as a journalist, I have mixed feelings about that sort of idea of this more subjective truth trying to get across to readers. I think the most important thing for me would be communicating to the reader in some way that this isn't a piece of journalism and this isn't intended as exploring the world as a journalist. There's a really interesting book, The Lifespan of a Fact. Do you know this book?
Yeah, sure.
And
John Degata.
yeah, and I think that this gets at sort of the different point of view of a fact checker or a journalist versus someone who's doing creative nonfiction. I mean, to me, if the word nonfiction is in it, it should be, I don't know. I think that.
You're a purist.
Well, yes. I think
me and John Degata are.
Yeah.
I really disagree with him.
Okay.
You know, I believe in facts.
Yeah.
Facts are facts.
Yeah,
And
'cause
if
he was
you
just
want-
making stuff
If
up,
you want
right?
to blur nonfiction and fiction, then it's fiction.
Yeah.
I agree with you. And what I write, and I
Good.
think what a lot of these I mean, it is journalism, but
Yeah.
it's a different kind of journalism that accommodates both a level of total facticity, but allowing for that subjectivity, which you were saying at first, is kind of like, you know, that's
think
our essential
As
point
long
of
as
view.
there's some way to communicate to the reader that you were wrong, I think that would be important if you do in fact realize that you were wrong.
How about like a wink, wink in parentheses?
Maybe, as long as it's clear.
I know what you- I know
I
what
don't
you
know.
mean. I know.
I think I'd have to read the actual piece, but I think it gets, especially right now with people calling Harper's and other publications fake news, right? Like I think that it gets increasingly important to at least communicate to the reader when we aren't sure or when we're playing with that a little bit. Yeah,
So don't play around so much right now.
maybe
please.
not.
Maybe. Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Watch it. Just watch it, Jay. Yost, you had a question. You wondered if Brooke Borel would be willing to share a couple of anecdotes with us.
So one of the things I learned about fact checking is how hard it is. Do you have any specific memories of you correcting a rather low stakes error, and then do you have any memories of you correcting a rather high stakes error?
The low stakes one is one this is really embarrassing, but this is one I use in a bunch of my talks, and I've actually named a test after this called the polar bear test. When I was actually working on this book, I went on Twitter one morning. So this wasn't in a story, this was just fact checking in real life. I went on Twitter one morning, I was drinking my tea and getting ready to work, and on Twitter, because I'm a science journalist, I follow a lot of science accounts and various things, and I can't remember what account it was. But it wasn't just like a science is awesome kind of like you're not so sure if they're like giving you good information. It was an actual institution, a science institution. And they tweeted out this picture of a baby polar bear. And they're like, oh, isn't this so cute? Look at this cute baby polar bear. And it was this picture of a polar bear, this tiny polar bear with these big eyes and like this glowing white fur. And I just said, yeah, that's really cute. And I retweeted it. And within probably half a second, and I was working on this book, I was getting ready to go and like work on the manuscript. And within half a second, one of my followers tweeted back to me an actual picture of a baby polar bear, or it wasn't baby, it was a newborn polar bear. And it was, he was like, that's not a newborn polar bear. This is what you have retweeted as a stuffed animal. And it was. And as soon as I saw the pictures he sent me, I was like, of course, like a newborn mammal is not like big open eyes and like glowing fur. These baby or newborn polar bears looked like they were pink and their eyes were like this, and they were gross looking, and I was really embarrassed. So I think that even people who are professional journalists and professional fact checkers, we sort of, this isn't totally answering your question, but we can fall prey to the, the temptation of retweeting something and having an emotional reaction to it.
Do you think the original tweet was ironic?
Nope, they were really embarrassed. They also were tagged on the retweet, and they're like, "Oh my God, we're so sorry." And it was like if you look it up, I think that this has been sort of a little mini hoax of this polar bear getting used in other ways. It's kind of embarrassing. Fact checking a high stakes. A lot of the stories that I have fact checked in my career have been more. They have not been high stakes so much in the sense of they don't have, they're not political stories with, anonymous sources or anything like that. So I'm kind of blanking on thinking of a good example there.
It might come down to what we define as high stakes, right?
Yeah.
Because, I read Yos's question and I thought, oh, yeah, a real
That's
make
true.
or break fact, something on which this entire piece hinges. But I could also think of something that's as embarrassing as retweeting a stuffed animal.
Embarrassing.
Maybe not crucial to the central logic or thesis of a piece, but would make the writer appear as though they hadn't done their homework.
This is another one that's maybe not so high stakes, but another thing that comes to mind, I was fact checking a very experienced and well-known physics writer at Quanta magazine one time when I was a fact checker there, and that writer had quoted The Big Lebowski in her piece. And everything, I couldn't find any mistakes with most of the science, but she misquoted The Big Lebowski, and I had to go up and look up the original scene and everything. So it sounds silly, but having a mistake like that, people are going to jump all over that, and then they might discount the rest of the piece. So really, any big mistake that, even if it's not high stakes, that's going to harm someone, or if you get it wrong, cause a lawsuit, it damages your reputation, which is how I felt about the polar bear situation.
Yeah. And our opportunities for humor. I mean, we looked at a couple of corrections in our class. One of them was from the New York Times, which published on May 10th, 2016. Because of an editing error, an article on Monday about a theological battle being fought by Muslim imams and scholars in the West against the Islamic State misstated the Snapchat handle used by Suhaib Webb, one of the Muslim leaders speaking out. Actually, there's a typo in this correction. One of Muslim leaders speaking out. It is Imam Suhaib Webb, not Pimpin' for Paradise 786. So it's hard to imagine how something like that made it through the levels. And then we speculated in class, how did something like that make it into print? Maybe a copy and paste error, maybe. And actually, another student, I don't know if she's here, Haley, just sent me a podcast devoted to a copy and paste error that blew up into a social media scandal for a major airline. And then we also looked at this screenshot from the Washington Post, which I found on Twitter last year. And this just appeared in the running text of an article. President Trump reportedly eschews exercise because he believes it drains the body's finite energy resources. But experts say this argument is flawed because the human body actually becomes stronger with exercise. So then again, we speculated, which experts did you consult? How many? What is the threshold for fact-checking a claim like that? And when does a writer decide to... So there are stakes and there are stakes, I suppose, and some of them are matters of tone and some of them are matters of integrity for writing. What questions do we have for the audience? From the audience? We could have questions for the audience, but I'm more interested in questions from the audience. Sam.
Thanks. Hi. I've recently read a few pieces talking about how video editing technology is improving to the point that we're going to see increasing amounts of videos that we can't trust. And I think the most recent one was by Franklin Foer in The Atlantic, talking about this is, if we think it's bad now, it's about to get a whole lot worse, and we're going to really lose reality in a sense once we can't trust our eyes any longer. So I'm wondering, if you've thought about this issue and if things are about to get a lot worse.
It terrifies me. There's a really great Radiolab episode where they played around with this technology, and I think they made a video of Obama saying something that he never said, and they have it very clearly labeled, like this is not real, but that technology is getting better. My understanding of it, and you will need to fact check this, is that you can talk to some experts who understand how those sorts of videos are made, because there is some sort of digital fingerprint that gets put on those videos and sort of the back end coding and such that you can sort of dig into and figure out. But I think it's pretty hard to do and takes time. And by the time you figure out if something's fake, the damage has been done, right? So I don't have a good answer for you other than at this point, being aware that technology is coming, and it's not quite to the point now, I think, where it's good enough to really fool people. Even that video that they made at Radiolab, I think you can tell it feels off, but it's getting there. So yeah.
You couldn't tell that the stuffed animal.
That's true. Well, that was a personal flaw, not... Yeah, that's true. That's true. People will see what they want to believe. I wanted to believe there was a cute polar bear that I was sharing with everyone. Someone might believe those videos, even if they're not perfect yet.
Seriously, it might include more of a forensic presence in fact checking.
Yeah, it's a good It's that it will probably require people with the technical skills to do that forensics, and also people with the journalism skills to call up the people in the videos and report it out. But then if we have people that don't believe the press, then I guess I don't know if that's gonna help. Sorry, that was really depressing.
We have another question here.
Oh, I feel a little silly now. You mentioned President Trump. And
Did I? I didn't mean to.
You did, indeed. And, I mean, what do you do about someone like that who you'd have to check everything that comes out of his mouth? I mean...
I think journalists are
What do we
still-
do, Brooke?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not a White House correspondent or a political reporter, but I think that the press has been trying to figure that out as they go along. And in some cases, I think they've been doing a really good job. In some cases, not. I remember early on, for example, some of the framing. People were talking a lot about framing headlines in the early days of his presidency, because you would see a headline with a quote from him. And the quote would actually contain a lie, but the headline wouldn't necessarily call it out, and it would call it out later in the piece. So keeping those things in mind and making sure that you're framing things in a way that it's clear to the reader what's correct and what isn't.
I remember a lot
I
of
don't know.
hand-wringing early in the administration about whether to use the word lie
Yeah.
or whether it's a matter of exaggeration or... Can
Different
you give us
publications
context
have-
for that from the field? Like, what is it about the word lie that journalists
I don't know
want
if
to be
I could
especially
speak
careful?
eloquently
Or
on
maybe
that. 'Cause
Avery.
I've read a little bit about this, but I don't really understand all of the. I think I don't know. I think maybe it probably has to do with the level of evidence they need to prove that it's definitely a lie versus not. And perhaps some things are probably lies, but can you use that word? And are there legal implications? I'm not sure though. People that actually do that coverage and
Intent.
intent. That's another important thing.
Connotation of intent.
Yeah.
And whether or not you put it in quotation marks, because that means it's ambivalent if the future or not.
Yeah.
You can
It's
track
very
whether-
tricky. It gets tricky.
Bob?
Thanks. Yeah, just on that, I mean, come on, like if you say someone's lying, people know what you mean. Anyway, I really like what you said, that you don't think that human objectivity exists. And also another question reminded me of this idea that I have of this world of the truth, basically, where on a basic level, things are as we experience them in the world, and we trust our experiences, and then we have a circle of friends that we trust, and then scientists are proving things in ways that we have basic understanding of the scientific community and how it works. And then there's journalism, which is very much, there's a level of journalism which is very scientific journalism, and then there's this world of people just writing things down. And
I like that distinction.
yeah, and it's sort of
The world of people just writing things down versus
and
other
in a
kinds
way
of journalism.
that's also religious writing down. You know, like there are people who have written things down over the centuries about what's true, and we accept some of those things as the truth because of our cultural backgrounds. So I was just wondering if you could comment on how you feel about subjectivity and objectivity and that idea.
I mean, I'm not a philosopher, so I'll probably butcher some of these thoughts. But I mean, I think that when I say that humans aren't objective, that doesn't mean that we can't strive towards objectivity, right? Like that's why the scientific method exists. That's journalism also follows something very similar to the scientific method through verification and through getting sourcing and through verifying facts with multiple sources, that sort of thing. So we do the best we can. I mean, even scientists, though, using the scientific method have sometimes really screwed things up because of their biases. So I think we do the best we can with those tools, but we have to be skeptical of we have to be skeptical all the time and really check ourselves and remind ourselves that we all have our biases, and we need to challenge ourselves and think about our biases in all contexts, whether we're scientists or journalists or just the public consuming all of that information that's coming out.
Do you think part of that conversations with our friends and
That depends on who your friends are. I mean, I don't know. It depends on what circles you run in and what they think about. I don't know. It depends.
Bob Walther had a question, I think.
Hi, I'm a reference librarian, actually down Locust Walk at Van Pelt Library. And reading your book, I could not help but notice that there were no mentions of libraries or librarians, I believe, in the whole thing. Do you really not use libraries?
No, this is an interesting point. I personally, when I was working as a fact checker, I did sometimes go to libraries, but not often. Everything is so digitalized now that a lot of our work we are able to do, and a lot of it was also calling up sources and re-interviewing people. Perhaps if another person had written this book, like I've talked to fact checkers who have been at National Geographic for decades, for example, and they used to always go to the library, and now their sort of system has also changed. That's a good point. I'll make a note of that for the next version.
I want to make a brief shout out to the Horticultural Library in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, where a librarian helped me fact check all of the botanical names for something that I was copy editing. And yeah, God bless librarians.
Yeah. It's a good note.
So I've got a question about referencing the past, and maybe this involves libraries as well. When back in college, when I was in college, I actually did some investigative reporting on a hedge fund that Yale University had a few $1 billion invested in, and actually we decided I was working with a union, Local 34. And so, we discovered a lot about this hedge fund. I think that what we found, actually, the fallout actually from publishing information, we did lots of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, and things like that. And we found ties, to this hedge fund, to dictatorship regimes in Indonesia, to private prison industry, to privatization of water, to factory failure in Argentina. And this hedge fund actually involved $20 billion of university money around the globe. And I got targeted as a student leader, and I almost lost my life. So, I think that I feel like it's very important. In fact, Tom Steyer, who's now no longer the head of Fairlawn Capital Management, was running for governor of California, and I brought up the web archives of this stuff, because now he's a green billionaire and he's changed his policies, investment policies, because of this investment campaign disclosure. And I just want to ask you guys, what's important to you? It's I feel like it's really important to go to a fucking library. And to reference the past. And I realize we're in this age of media that, and Twitterdom, and I've participated in Twitter and things like that too. But I left Twitter. I'm barely, I don't even know if I'm on Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, whatever's happening, my news, And so I really feel like it's important to use the digital realm and also to leave the digital realm alone and to bring people out of, whatever matrix they're in the digital realm. I think it's important to be in both worlds, because fake news, I don't even know how it's defined these days, honestly, and especially I think you mentioned the intersection of race, it's just there's, just even reporting for, when I was interviewing with Wall Street Journal and interviewing with these big papers back, whatever years ago, what gets in the news, is very subjective to who's holding the power, who holds the money, what people care about. So it's just I'm I'm at a loss. I feel like I have checked out. I kind of checked out of a lot of media reporting these days, except Harper's Magazine.
Which isn't online, really.
Well, I don't read it. I read the magazine. I
They're
mean,
kinda
actually,
anti-
I'm into reading magazines these
I don't
days,
know.
and and there's also like, of course, there's always a level of subjectivity and a level of like, but I feel like it's it's just, I don't know. This is not really a question. This is just me being like frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
It's a frustrating time, and I think that there's I think it's a good idea to have. I think it's impossible to completely check out of the digital world. It's something that's so ingrained in our world right now, and so much information is on there, and it has a lot of useful parts to it, right? But I think it's certainly a good idea to check out sometimes and to make sure that you're in the real world as well.
Brooke, is there anything in your decision to launch this podcast, these conversations with, I can't remember the term you used, the knowledge, the folks who figure out how to use knowledge. Is there something in the impulse to start that series of conversations which maybe gets to this question about what is the role of history? What is our relationship to the sort of on the ground, I have to fact check this thing this afternoon, but the much longer conversation about what makes it into the news, how does the information get curated, what's going on with social media platforms. Is it about making some of our methods and our understandings of fairness and accuracy a little more transparent to each other across various boundaries?
Yes. I mean, a lot of the sort of backstory of how people find facts don't always make it into the final story, right? And I think that a lot of reporters are really good about doing that and showing their work in the piece. And I think that people are doing that more now considering the current political moment. But you can't put every single thing in the story. It's impossible. You have word limits. You have you're in competition for reader eyeballs because there's so many other things on the internet that can get their attention away from it. So one of the things we're interested in with that podcast is to talk about sort of those backstory things and talk about how did you know. So we're trying to focus each episode on a particular thing that person has made, whether it's a book or an article or a scientific paper or whatever, and sort of dig into that. And I often will ask questions about things that didn't end up in the book, like claims that they made, or things that didn't end up in the footnotes or whatever, and ask more about like what's the process of confirming this thing. But it's only a half-hour podcast, so we do what we can in like the half hour, right?
But in your choice to call it methods, it strikes me that like there's this nice emphasis on the form. Let's talk about the form.
Yeah,
of how,
it's really about
how these
process
things
and
come
form,
together.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We'll take maybe one or two more questions. Beth has a question.
I would just, this is a sort of more esoteric question, but being a fact checker, having been a fact checker, having to climb through research, having to really look at things in a very deep and piercing way, do you feel more rooted in your own knowledge, in your own sense of who you are as you move through the world as someone who knows things?
I wish. On certain topics, yes. Or I at least feel as though I have the tools, except for when I'm reacting to a picture of a polar bear on Twitter. I think that having that training as a journalist or a fact checker or anyone else that sort of has had to dig through research and really be skeptical of things, I think having those tools can be very helpful in navigating the world in general and seeing the red flags when something doesn't ring quite right.
So is that part of your hope with your book and your work and your podcast to, many of us won't grow up or grow down, in my case, to become fact checkers. But if we read what you do, if we listen to your podcast, if we think about methods, can we be smarter navigators of the world?
I
Is
hope
that
so.
part of your...
I hope so, and that's a lot what this book is about. I mean, this particular style of fact checking, this editorial fact checking, is something that you would really only learn if you had a very specific kind of job in media. And it's not necessarily something that they teach in journalism school. That's not to say that journalism school doesn't teach verification and the fact that we need to get our facts right, because they do. But they don't always have this sort of extra step of here's what a fact checker does, and here's sort of the process of that, right? So the whole point of this book was to bring that out of newsrooms where people normally learn it as an apprenticeship almost, or as an early job, as an internship, and bring it out and say, here's how they do it, and here are ways that you can adapt it to your own writing. If you aren't working with a fact checker, here's how you can use it. If you're in a newsroom that can't afford a fact checker, here are some tricks to, here's the really intense way to do it, and here are the keep that in your mind always. And then as you go forward with your work, even if you can't always do this, you have it in your mind.
But even if we're not readers.
And readers too. Yeah, I think readers too can carry this along. And if you see something you're skeptical of, I mean, newsmaker, like journalists and other people making news, they are very serious about their jobs and they care about getting things right, but they're also human, right? So I think that just keeping all of that in mind and bringing a skeptical eye to what you're reading and understanding all the work that goes into it, and all of those things can help you be a better consumer of media and just better consumer of everything happening in the world.
We have another question in the back.
Hi. My question is sort of along the lines of what you're talking about. It's about accountability. Obviously, mistakes happen and biases happen. What responsibility do you think people with public platforms, whether it's journalists or writers, have, and how should they approach mistakes that they have made? I think about your tweet about the polar bear, of course, but also like National Geographic's recent article about acknowledging their racist past. So I'm really curious what your thoughts are.
It's funny you bring up the National Geographic thing. My first response in my head when you were saying that was fix it immediately. Like as soon as you know that you've made an error, you should fix the record. You should run a correction if it's a huge. And one of the problems, though, that we're learning, there's an increasing body of research that shows that people who have read that original mistake don't always read the correction. Like it doesn't reach the same level of audience that original error did, which is unfortunate. But we do the best we can. So correcting the error immediately. I think outlets should be tweeting out when they have a major error and like putting it on all of their social media platforms. There should. Depending on the severity of the error, a lot of times the error will just be corrected at the bottom of the piece. I think that if it's really bad, they should have a note at the top of the piece. But the Nat Geo thing you just brought up, that wasn't something they corrected immediately for a lot of reasons, probably. I mean, it's like a historical progression. There's a lot of time to reflect on that. There's a lot of criticism over the years, like trying to put all of their past, their racist past in context. I think it's good that they did that. It might have been nice if they did it sooner, but I think it's important I think it's a good step, and I think it's good for all people who are in the public eye making things for the public to read and inform the public should have that kind of responsibility and that sort of self-reflection. And for the polar bear thing, I tweeted immediately. I think I retweeted the actual picture. I was like, I'm really sorry.
Avery Rome has a question.
Yes. I was just going to point out that the New York Times is trying to address the lack of coverage of women in their obituaries.
Oh, yeah.
Recently, I used to think that women had it good in New York because they never died. But there is another case of our vision becoming clearer with new information as we also, lose the vision for the future until we examine it again.
Yeah, I think it's a good project that they're doing. I think it's a shame they weren't doing it all along, but it's better late than never, I guess. I don't know. Yeah,
Caroline, you had a question about something that we listened to the Mike Daisy episode of This American Life in class, as well as the hour-long retraction. And you had a question about that and another case study that you wanted to ask about.
Yeah, so I guess maybe a lot of people think about it this way, that there's like a spectrum of errors. Like maybe a misspelling doesn't matter too much, or maybe 1 year off in the scheme of things wouldn't be a huge deal, depending, obviously. But like some stories, like we were thinking about the Mike Daisy, we were thinking about the Rolling Stone UVA.
Sure.
And I'm curious what you think the lasting impact of small errors versus maybe more large-scale content errors is, not only to the reputation of the publication, but to the public perception of the subject, such as like sexual assault on campus, but also just like how people perceive news in general. I know that was kind of a lot.
No, I'm thinking I have no data to back this up, so this is just my impression. But I think that both are important. The biggest mistakes that fact checkers are often catching, like usually there aren't big thesis shattering mistakes in pieces once it's made it to the level of the fact checker, usually. There are some exceptions to that, and the Rolling Stone rape on campus is one of those. I mean, that made it past all of them. I think that both are a problem, though. I think that in that case, that particular story intended to shed light on something that is an actual problem in the world, but they've done so much damage to it by pushing that story out. That's huge. That's going to last. That damage will last for a very long time, I would predict. But those little mistakes, I mean, typos, there is sort of a spectrum, I think. And typos here and there. Any little mistake, though, if it's that reader's thing, if you got their thing wrong, that they know a lot about, and it's going to annoy them, and it's going to make them not trust you as much. So doing the best we can to get those things right, even the small things, is really important.
Do you hear from readers who have their thing and they want you to know that you got their thing wrong?
Yeah.
Like their serial comma or their...
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good one recently. Nothing's coming to mind. I mean, I wrote another book about bed bugs, so if anyone has questions about bed bugs, I can answer those too. And in that particular
I'm
book...
just going to say for my anxiety level, let's not touch that topic today, but
I've been told
maybe
my book
that'll be
is soothing, even if you've had bed bugs. I've had bed bugs 3 times, and that's why I wrote the book, but that's another topic. I don't have them right now, don't worry. But with
Thank
that,
you for
most
clarifying.
books are not fact-checked. The publishers don't pay for it, and it's up to the writer to check everything. And it's really, really hard, like I said earlier, to check your own work, let alone something that's like 10,000 or 100,000 rather words. So I fact-checked that book myself, and I missed a couple of things that are kind of small, but the people, they meant a lot to the people. Like in one case, I called something a virus that was really a parasite, which sounds like maybe to the average person, who cares? But the person, and I knew that was wrong, and I called it the correct things on all the other paragraphs where I wrote about it. But the person one of the people I had interviewed for that piece is someone I actually know personally, and she sent me a message. She was like, "I'm so excited to read the book," and I was like, on page 146, I made a little mistake. I'm really sorry. And that's like what she's been spending her entire life studying, is this parasite, right? So so that was really embarrassing, and we fixed it in the paperback. Yeah, it's painful when that happens, even if it seems like it's not a big deal to the general public. Mostly, it's a big deal to someone.
That's a good transition to what I think will be our last question. Joost, you had a question about scientific papers and fact-checking.
So recently, there's these Penn researchers who made an algorithm to detect fraudulent scientific images on scientific research. It's pretty cool. But I was just curious about how can we fact-check scientific papers, if that's a thing?
It is a thing, and as a science journalist, and good science journalists will do this when they're deciding to cover a paper, although there's a whole other conversation to be had about whether we should be covering single scientific papers, but that's for another time. Whether they're covering a paper or whether they're writing a feature that includes a body of work, you should never take one single paper as this is the truth. It's a collection of this much larger body of work. Science is a dynamic, changing thing, right? So making sure that you are taking that paper and considering it in the context of the other literature, whether by doing literature searches and looking at other papers, or by calling other experts who aren't involved in the production of that particular scientific paper and interviewing them. Like, these are the things that a science journalist will do to make sure they're covering that fairly and putting all the caveats in, because no single scientific paper is going to be a perfect reflection of the world. It's one little piece of a much larger process.
I like that we're ending on process. Thank you so much to Brooke Borel for coming all the way to Philadelphia to be with us. Thank you to Joost and Caroline for helping me interview her. Thanks to everyone who came today.